So good evening and welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. Professor Alan Guelzo is a New York Times bestseller author, American historian, and commentator on public issues whose work has been featured in many major publications and on TV programs such as The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. In 2010, he was nominated for a Grammy Award along with David Strathairn and Richard Dreyfuss for their production of the entirety of the Lincoln-Douglas debates on BBC Audio. He is the only three-time winner of the Lincoln Prize for his scholarship. Currently director of the James Madison Program Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship and senior research scholar in the Council of the Humanities at Princeton University. He previously was Director of Civil War Era Studies and the Henry R. Luce Professor of the Civil War Era at Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Among his many award-winning publications, he is the author of Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, The End of Slavery in America, Lincoln and Douglas, The Debates That Defined America, and Lincoln, A Very Short Introduction in the Oxford University Press Very Short Introduction series. In 2012, he published Fateful Lightning, A New History of the Civil War and Reconstruction with Oxford University Press. And in 2013, Alfred Knopf published his book on the Battle of Gettysburg for the 150th anniversary, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, which spent 8 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. His most recent publications are Redeeming the Great Emancipator from Harvard University Press, and Reconstruction, a concise history from Oxford University Press. From 2006 to 2013, he served as a member of the National Council of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is speaking to us today about Lincoln and Gettysburg on American national identity, Lincoln at Gettysburg. In the initial talk in the Questioning American Identity series, sponsored by the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship, with much appreciated support from the Bucknell President's Office. This series seeks to explore current issues and what it means to be American, sometimes with controversial speakers, and sometimes, as especially in the case tonight, by looking at the shared history of Americans. Lincoln at Gettysburg is a topic especially dear to my heart. I grew up hearing stories about how my mother's grandfather was at the old wooden Beehive building in Chicago when Lincoln was nominated for the presidency in 1860 by the Republicans, with the yells and stomping on the timbered platforms deafening, according to family stories. More recently, I've taught a course on Lincoln's public rhetoric and Civil War literature, which involved a field trip to Gettysburg from Bucknell on the anniversary of the first day of the battle. Antifa protesters were supposed to arrive, and open-carry militia members on the opposite side had already arrived as Antifa protest plans were rerouted to Philadelphia. It was a reminder to all of us in the class about how issues from that era still have relevance and resonance today. But Bucknellians had made the trip long before, and more significantly, and at least one, Andrew Gregg Tucker, class of 1862, gave his life as a result of wounds sustained during the battle, when the university had closed so that students could head south to help defend the bridge at Harrisburg against Confederate invasion. It's an honor and privilege to have Professor Guelzo here today as the most eminent living Civil War and Lincoln scholar. Let's welcome him to Bucknell.
Thank you, Al, for that entirely too long introduction. I want to start with an item tonight. On the first anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, a commemoration ceremony taking place at Ground Zero featured New York Governor George Pataki reading the Gettysburg Address. Now, another item. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. told a black journalist that his "I Have a Dream" speech was designed to be a sort of a Gettysburg Address. And he opened it with words directly modeled on the Gettysburg Address. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And a third item. In the 1935 movie Ruggles of Red Gap, an English butler, played by Charles Lawton, set loose on the American frontier, establishes his right to a piece of the American dream by reciting, in front of a saloon full of incredulous cowboys, the Gettysburg Address. Now, is it too much to ask, what exactly is going on here? The short story of the Gettysburg Address is that it was a surprisingly short speech, all of 272 words, delivered by Abraham Lincoln as part of the dedication ceremonies for the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg on November 19, 1863, 4.5 months after the climactic battle of the American Civil War there. But the long story is that no single American utterance has had the staying power or commanded the respect and reverence accorded the Gettysburg Address. It has been engraved on the south wall of the Lincoln Memorial, translated in a book devoted to nothing but translations of the Gettysburg Address, and analyzed in at least 9 full-dress critical studies over the last century. It has become the stuff of American myth and legend, ranging from the story invented in the 1880s that Lincoln wrote the address as an afterthought on the back of an envelope on the train bringing him to Gettysburg, to the equally dubious story that no one in the audience of 10 to 15,000 people who heard Lincoln read it initially thought it was any good. Let me push some of the myths out of the way. Actually, Lincoln had been working on his remarks for days before leaving Washington for the dedication ceremonies, and he had a full, finished version in hand when he boarded the train. As a chronically fussy and unsatisfied editor of his own words, he did write a new ending once he arrived in Gettysburg, but there is nothing which suggests he wrote any part of the address en route. There is even less reason to believe the canard, manufactured principally by Lincoln's friend and bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamon, that the address fell as flat as a wall on its hearers at Gettysburg. To the contrary, the response of the American public was at once a mixture of astonishment and admiration. The crowd in the cemetery listened, according to a witness whose letter was published 11 days after the ceremonies, as he slowly, clearly read the address, and you could not mistake the feeling and sentiment of the vast multitude before him. The same impression was made at a distance by those who read the text of the address in the newspapers. This morning's paper, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote to his publisher the day after the dedication ceremonies, brings the report of Lincoln's brief speech at Gettysburg, which seems to me admirable. Lincoln's brief speech, according to Ralph Waldo Emerson, will not easily be surpassed by words on any recorded occasion. Charles Sumner believed that Lincoln was mistaken when he said that the world would little note nor long remember any of what was said by anyone at the dedication ceremonies. To the contrary, Sumner said, the world noted at once what he said and will never cease to remember it. The battle itself was less important than the speech. Since Simonides wrote the epitaph, for those who fell at Thermopylae, nothing equal to them has been breathed over the fallen dead. Within 20 months of its delivery, the Gettysburg Address was already being anthologized in elocution primers for memorization and for school use. So much for myths. But looked at from a distance, even the myths are a backhanded tribute to the address. Only a document of near divine inspiration could have been written on a lurching, soot-filled 19th century train, and a speech of really world historical moment would certainly arch so far above the heads of its first hearers as to leave them baffled. However, historical sheet straightening of this sort only begs my question, which is not really whether people in 1863 understood the address to have been a mountaintop piece of political rhetoric, but why it struck so many people as being such from the start. Partly, this was because of its language. The Gettysburg Address obeys the Churchillian dictum: short words are best, and the old words, when short, are best of all. Much has been written, and will be written, about the simple grandeur of the address, its reliance on short, pungent, colloquial vocabulary, over against the hyper-inflected, Latinate lexicon beloved of so many school textbooks of the day. In this address of 272 words, 190 of them are single syllables. Only 4 are 4 syllables. Rarely has so much been compressed into such simple and uncomplicated elements. But I am not sure that the simplicity of Lincoln's vocabulary explains very much on its own. Short words are not necessarily interesting words, or even clear ones, and certainly not every word in the address is short. It is not just a simplified vocabulary which makes the Gettysburg Address remarkable, but an overall pattern of conscious simplicity which Lincoln adopted. Public speaking in Lincoln's day was actually a 4-way struggle between several different patterns of speech: vernacular or folk speech, technical speech, as in instruction manuals, middling speech, and classical or academic speech. What Lincoln had always adopted as his style of speech was the pattern of middling speech, the speech of the lawyers, popular preachers, and newspapers. Middling speech was a mark above the slangy bluntness of folk or vernacular speech, but without the overreaching for the inflated, euphemistic, self-conscious speech of the literati. It occupied the same middle ground occupied culturally and politically by Lincoln's own Republican Party, which aspired to represent the American middle class. Like the middle-class entrepreneurs, commercial farmers, and manufacturers whom Lincoln praised and defended, as over against the slave-owning plantation class, middling speech could verge on the plainness of slang, as Lincoln sometimes did, to the discomfort of the prissy, but it was also rational enough to sustain argument. It could have both an inelegant plainness and occasional peaks of refined professionalism. This middling style of speech was what George Ticknor Curtis called a talking style, with a little more of elegant déshabille, a free, bold Anglo-Saxon hittingness. Just how consciously middling Lincoln wanted the Gettysburg Address to be can be seen from how he constructed the famous opening line, 87 years ago. On July 7th, 1863, speaking to an exultant crowd which had gathered in the White House driveway to cheer Lincoln for the newly announced victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Lincoln offered what we should consider as the first draft of the Gettysburg Address. It was not a planned-for occasion. Lincoln was speaking off the cuff, and it showed. How long ago is it? 80-odd years Since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, that was the birthday of the United States of America. Now, on this last 4th of July just passed, when we have a gigantic rebellion at the bottom of which is an effort to overthrow the principle that all men were created equal, we have the surrender of a most powerful position and army on that very day. And not only so, but in a succession of battles in Pennsylvania, near to us, through 3 days, so rapidly fought that they might be called one great battle on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of the month of July. And on the 4th, the cohorts of those who oppose the declaration that all men are created equal turn tail and run. Now you can hear the advance echoes of what will become the Gettysburg Address in these words, but they appear in the pattern of vernacular or folk speech, unscripted and unself-conscious. How long ago is it? 80-odd years? And strung along in a single, awkwardly run-together sentence that piles up rebellion, Vicksburg, and Gettysburg all in one big disjointed stack. 4.5 months later, however, these words will become the memorable 87 years ago. And the ungainly allusion to rebellion and battle will become a swift, neat progression from a great civil war to a great battlefield of that war. That is the distance between vernacular speech on July 7th and middling speech on November 19th. 87 years ago is, therefore, a stretch toward middle-class refinement. But notice that Lincoln does not stretch it all the way to becoming classical, to Simonides and Thermopylae. The model from which Lincoln developed the vocabulary of 87 years comes not from classical Athens, but from another contemporary political speech, a highly touted thank you given in July of 1861 by Pennsylvania Congressman Galusha Grow after his election as Speaker of the House of Representatives. This is what Grow said. 80 years ago, 56 bold merchants, farmers, lawyers, and mechanics, the representatives of a few feeble colonists scattered along the Atlantic seaboard, met in convention to found a new empire based on the inalienable rights of man. There's no way of telling what it was in these words of Galusha Grow's, which stuck in Lincoln's mind for 2 years. But it definitely cancels out any notion that Lincoln was reaching for a classical style. If anything, the unprecedented popularity which attached itself at once to the Gettysburg Address actually marks the end of the prestige and dominance of classical speech in American rhetoric, and its sad consignment to oddity. The Gettysburg Address marks the end of the culture of eloquence, burying it alongside the soldiers in the National Cemetery. Still, anyone with ears to hear in 1863 would have heard more than just Galusha Grow in that opening 87 years ago. Those words would have been instantly recognizable as a rhetorical shadow of the meditation on the brevity of human life. The days of our years are 80 years and 10. In Psalm 90, verse 10, in the Authorized or King James Version of the Bible. The new nation which the founders brought forth upon this continent. That, likewise, is a shadow of Luke chapter 2, verse 7, where the Virgin Mary brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger. But certainly the most obvious biblical allusion was the one reserved for the end of the address, that dedication to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, which will result in a new birth of freedom. The new birth being an echo of the 3rd chapter of St. John's Gospel, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. These echoes of the authorized version of the Bible may suggest to our modern sensibilities something far more ornate and recondite than middling speech. But in fact, the authorized version was very much the property of middling speakers. Lincoln had it ground to familiarity in his childhood, and it provided an easy rhetorical connection to a population which still understood and embraced the authorized version as tantamount to God's own speech. Far from representing a form of classical speaking, the 19th century saw 2 major elite campaigns to unseat the dominance of the authorized version. The first in the 1830s and the second in the 1880s, culminating in the creation of the revised version of 1881 to 1885. Significantly, the revisers were bitterly contested at almost every turn, precisely because they represented the interests of scholars, linguists, and historians in producing a document more in harmony with their own expectations of the present standard of biblical scholarship, which has made very great advances since 1911. While the authorized version was, for all of its Elizabethan and Jacobean origins, clung to determinedly by middle-class speakers for another century. So the Gettysburg Address was not an effort by Lincoln to confine himself simply to a collection of monosyllabic grunts. He was showing how a great idea could be captured without resorting to the stilted formality of classical speech. And in that respect, the Gettysburg Address was one slice of a larger culture war being waged by a free labor middle class against, on the one hand, an elite culture of slaveholders and their allies who despised middle-class values, and a vernacular culture whose envy of the middle class had led them into an unholy alliance with the planters. The simplicity of the Gettysburg Address is real, but it was only part of a larger rhetorical strategy of Lincoln's for communicating and persuading politically. Sometimes the fame of the address is chalked up to a more humdrum quality, and that is its compactness. It is short, and therefore easy to remember and to memorize. It was, to be sure, intended to be short, since Lincoln had not been invited to deliver an oration. But in the words of the invitation issued by the local Gettysburg promoter, David Wills, to formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks. As Lincoln told the journalist, Noah Brooks, "My speech isn't long, it is short, short, short." There would be a formal oration, but it would be delivered not by Lincoln, but by the formidable Massachusetts orator Edward Everett, former Massachusetts congressman and governor, U.S. senator, briefly, member of President Millard Fillmore's cabinet, president of Harvard, and most recently, and most ironically, candidate for vice president in 1860 on the short-lived Constitutional Union Party ticket, running against Lincoln. And along with Everett, there would be a lengthy prayer from the congressional chaplain, Thomas Stockton, an ode composed by Benjamin French, and a benediction pronounced by the president of nearby Pennsylvania College, Henry L. Bauger, whose son lay buried in the nearby town cemetery, mortally wounded at Shiloh the year before. Everett as the principal draw of the November 19th ceremonies, delivered a 2.5-hour, 13,000-word doozy of an address. It was, in its own way, a perfectly respectable example of classical rhetorical art, coming from the former occupant of Harvard's Eliot Chair in Greek Literature. Everett began by reminding the thousands who crowded into the new cemetery that it was appointed by law in Athens that the obsequies of the citizens who fell in battle should be performed at the public expense and in the most honorable manner. And from there, Everett proceeded to invoke those who fell at Marathon, Horace's maxim that it is sweet and becoming to die for one's country. Romulus, Cyrus, and Caesar also put in appearances. And it all concludes with a quotation from Thucydides. "The whole earth," said Pericles as he stood over the remains of his fellow citizens who had fallen in the first year of the Peloponnesian War, "the whole earth is the sepulchre of illustrious men." The problem was that Everett's oration was all length and no soundbite. And at the end, there was little alternative to memorizing the whole thing or simply forgetting it. Lincoln's long suit, on the other hand, was his capacity to capture an idea in the fewest and clearest words possible. John Todd Stewart, who had been his first mentor in reading law and who knew Lincoln for over 30 years, thought that Lincoln was, simply by temperament, logical, mathematical. He had nothing rhetorical in his nature. Lincoln had, after all, been a trial lawyer in a state where juries were still pulled into the jury box from bystanders. And he would either make his point clearly and swiftly, or he would not be practicing law for very long. For that reason, Lincoln did not rate professional orators like Everett very highly. And to Noah Brooks, he singled out Everett as a particularly grinding example of sound and fury signifying nothing. Now, do you know, I think Edward Everett was very much overrated, Lincoln said. There was one speech in which, addressing a statue of John Adams and a picture of Washington in Faneuil Hall, Boston, he apostrophized them and said, "Teach us the love of liberty protected by law." That, Lincoln admitted, was very fine, but it was only a good idea, introduced by noble language. Looked at from that angle, Lincoln is a man of no verbal wastage. In the address, he describes the past and what it did, which was to create a republic of equal citizens. Then describes what the people at the ceremonies are doing in the present, which is dedicating a cemetery. And then moves to what they are to do for the future, dedicate themselves to the same principles the soldiers were dedicated to. In that way, the Gettysburg Address is almost anorexic. It makes no mention of slavery, the Constitution, or democracy. It paints no picture of the great battle. It even fails to acknowledge the civilian politicians, David Wills of Gettysburg, Andrew Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania, who made the purchase of the cemetery acreage possible. Yet, for all of its compactness, the Gettysburg Address is not quite so compact as it seems. It may be only 272 words long, but those 272 words are strung out into 10 complicated sentences, all of which are much more cumbersome to parse on the page than they are to hear in the open. As an exercise, try diagramming Lincoln's sentences in the Gettysburg Address. Their complexity will surprise you. And Lincoln does not mind throwing compactness to the wind when he wants to make a lilting impression on the ear. The well-known repetitive triplets, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. And government of the people, by the people, for the people, these are the exact opposite of compactness, and actually constitute a puzzling luxury if we consider the address as only a terse alternative to Everett, inclining to still more terseness. Lincoln was not offering a treatise to be read, but an exhortation to be heard. Like middling speech, the address is an effort to persuade rather than to ornament or decorate. And each stroke of those triplets is a powerful pull on the convictions of Lincoln's listeners, hauling them upwards toward climaxes that overcome the attentive mind with emotion, even as they persuade it with logic. So if not shortness or compactness, what does account for the fame of the Gettysburg Address? For that, we must hear the address as Lincoln's hearers heard it, and see that the real impact of the address arose from the single aspect of the address we are least likely to recognize at once. And that was the survival of democracy. We take democracy for granted as the default position of human societies, as the natural template of modern politics, as the end of history. And so it's difficult for us to be moved by an address which is, at bottom, a set of reasons why democracy should not be abandoned. Like Thomas Jefferson in 1826, we today are confident that the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them. But in truth, even as Jefferson wrote those words, the confidence of the founders that the disorders and oppressions and incertitude of Europe will terminate very much in favor of the rights of man was evaporating. The French Revolution, which promised to be the American Revolution's beachhead in Europe, swiftly circled downwards in the reign of terror, and then the tyranny of Bonaparte. Democratic uprisings in Spain in 1820, in Russia in 1825, in France in 1830, and across Europe in 1848 were crushed or subverted by newly renascent monarchies and romantic philosophers, glorying in regimes built upon blood and soil and nationality rather than the rights of man. At every point, democracy, government by the consent of the governed, lay discredited and disgraced. And a cynical Prussian nobleman, Otto von Bismarck, could advise his French counterpart that although, as he said, in early life his tendencies were all towards republicanism, he had discovered that when you have governed men for several years, you, a liberal, will be transformed from a republican to a monarchist. Believe me, one cannot lead or bring to prosperity a great nation without the principle of authority, that is, the monarchy. The outbreak of the American Civil War only gave the monarchs further reason to rejoice, because the success of the American democracy was the one thing which unsettled their captive peoples and threw their theories about the superiority of autocracy into a shade. That this same troublesome democracy would, in 1861, obligingly proceed to blow its own political brains out and do it in defense of the virtues of human slavery, gave the monarchs no end of delight. The success of the slave-holding secessionists in America would, breathed the King of the Belgians, Leopold I, with a sigh of relief, raise a barrier against the United States and provide a support for the monarchical aristocratic principle in the southern states. The Union is in agony, wrote the Spanish minister from Washington to his queen, and our mission is not to delay its death for a moment. Lincoln also saw the fundamental issue of the Civil War as the question of democracy's death, only from precisely the opposite perspective, from that of Bismarck and Leopold. This nation, Lincoln said, had been dedicated to the democratic proposition that all men are created equal. The Civil War was the test of whether democratic regimes, whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. It had survived, Lincoln said earlier, 2 severe tests of such a government, the successful establishing and the successful administering of it, but there remained this one final test, its successful maintenance against a formidable internal attempt to overthrow it, and that test was now upon them. The central idea pervading this struggle, Lincoln told his secretary, John Hay, back at the beginning of the war, is the necessity of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. For if we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves. If democracies were too unstable to prevent self-disintegration and too feckless to stop self-disintegration when it started, then the folly and instability of democracy would lie open and exposed for all time, and the collapse of what Lincoln called the last best hope of earth could be considered as proof positive of the need for a Bismarck or a Leopold to run the show. The Battle of Gettysburg, with its astounding and seemingly bottomless list of dead and maimed, offered Lincoln the first substantial glimmer during the war that the test would indeed be passed. Gettysburg was not only a victory, but a victory won with the Union armies back to the wall, and its news came with symbolic appropriateness on the anniversary of American independence. Above all, the victory was itself the product of enormous self-sacrifice. 3,903 Union dead, 18,735 wounded, 5,425 missing. A third, again more, than all the British and Allied casualties at Waterloo. And these casualties were not professional soldiers. They were not the Duke of Wellington's scum of the earth, who had taken their shilling and their chance together. Nor were they dispirited peasants, driven into battle by the whips of their betters, but precisely those ordinary citizens whom democracy's cultured despisers had laughingly doubted could ever be made to do anything but calculate profits and losses. These people, these middle-class bourgeoisie with their middle-class manners and middle-class tastes and middle-class speech, these Americans whom the German poet Heinrich Heine dismissed in 1834 as boors, living in that big pig pen of freedom, whom another German poet, Niklaus Lenau, raged at as appallingly dull and possessed of a strange, cold mirth. The same people whom Charles Dickens sneered at as the ebb of honest men's contempt. These had risen up and offered everything they had, present and future, that that nation might live. Looking out over the semicircular rows of graves in the Gettysburg Cemetery, Lincoln saw in them a transcendence that few people, then or now, have been willing to concede to liberal democracy. And in that transcendence, he saw something that all Americans could borrow, a renewed dedication to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, to popular self-government of the people, by the people, for the people. The genius of the address thus lay not in its language or its brevity, virtues though those are, but in its triumphant repudiation of the criticisms of democracy and in the new birth it gave to those who had become discouraged and wearied by democracy's follies. It is worth remembering how central a position the address gives to those who fought here, because there is a fourth reason for the high esteem in which we hold the Gettysburg Address, and that is that the Union won the Civil War. The Gettysburg Address is a remarkably optimistic document, and not surprisingly, much of its optimism was drawn from the euphoria following the battle and the fall of Vicksburg, which together gave Lincoln and the Union the happiest season they had enjoyed in the war since the early spring of 1862. The successes of the summer of 1863 continued, too, as Port Hudson surrendered after Vicksburg and opened the Mississippi River to almost complete control by Union forces, followed by the nearly bloodless capture of the rebel railhead at Chattanooga. And there were political victories as well. Against every prediction that summer, anti-war Copperhead candidates for governor in Ohio and Pennsylvania were resoundingly defeated in the fall elections. The signs look better. The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea. Peace does not appear so distant as it did, Lincoln wrote at the end of August 1863. And with it would come proof that democracies are not doomed to self-destruction, and that among free men there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet. But that optimism turned out to be cruelly premature. There was much bloody work ahead in 1864 and 1865, and if it had not gone well, if Grant had not taken Richmond, or Sherman not taken Atlanta, or Farragut not closed off Mobile Bay, and especially if Lincoln had not been reelected, then the war would have turned to a very different conclusion. With an independent Southern Confederacy hugging the Gulf and South Atlantic coastlines, strangling the Mississippi River Valley, and spreading its imperialistic pro-slavery tentacles into the Caribbean and Central America, while the Northern Union shrank into a Scandinavian irrelevance. In that case, the Gettysburg Address would not and could not have been hailed as acknowledging some great and stirring truth, but would instead stand as a piece of political huff and puff on behalf of a sinking cause. We see greatness in the address because we are allowed to, because untold numbers of soldiers died to ensure that we could. Without that vindication in arms, the Gettysburg Address would have become little noted and not very long remembered. And the multitudes buried in the National Cemetery would literally have died in vain. And all of that middling terseness and meaning built into the address would have counted for nothing. The Gettysburg Address is, when reduced to its minimum, only the remarks of an American president spoken at the dedication of a national cemetery. Unlike the Emancipation Proclamation, it cannot be taken into a court of law to prove anything. And it certainly did not, as the proclamation did, set 3 million slaves legally and forever free. On that scale, it can sometimes seem that the address is simply an example of something being well known for being well known. And it may be to avoid the phenomenon of empty celebrity that we fix on its vocabulary or its compactness as explanations for its high and enduring standing. It is really the meaning of the address which struck observers so deeply in 1863. And that this has become dimmed in our celebrations of the address is partly due to its own success. We see the Civil War today as an issue in racial justice, or as a critical moment in our constitutional history, which is what leads us to wonder why slavery and the Constitution do not appear in the address. But the truth is that the address speaks to an issue which flew far above slavery or jurisprudence, the issue on which the resolution of all of our racial injustices and constitutional shortcomings all actually depend. And that was the survival of democracy itself. For what we intended to do about race or slavery or the Constitution would never come to pass at all if, as Bismarck hoped, democracy itself went down for the 10 count in 1863. Lincoln was not under any illusions that he could save democracy merely by his own rhetorical power. He was more right than we think when he said that the world would little note nor long remember what we say here, because all that was said that November day by himself and by Everett, by Thomas Stockton, the congressional chaplain, and by Henry Balger, the college president, and by Benjamin French, the third-rate poet, all of that rested entirely on never forgetting what they did here. It was from them, not from his words, that the new birth of freedom would emerge. Perhaps, in the end, the greatness we have not suspected in the address lies in its humility, its reminder that the question of democracy's survival rested ultimately in the hands not of politicians, but in the hands of citizens who saw something in democracy worth dying for. Something that kings or slave masters or bureaucrats could never understand. What we needed and got so memorably from Lincoln was precisely that reminder. We could use it again today. Thank you very much. I have been told by Professor Sievers that we have some time for questions. And I think there are microphones here. These are they. So I believe the floor is open. If you would kindly stand and indicate your desire to ask a question, and when you do, please tell us who you are, and then your question.
I'm Tom from White Springs, a village here in Union County. I bring to your attention the maxim which we've all heard, that brevity is the soul of wit. And many hear the noun wit as if it means humor, and often the funniest things in life are shortly stated, but it really means intelligence. We realize you're a Lincoln scholar, perhaps not a presidential scholar, but would you say that President Lincoln was the smartest president we've ever had?
There are many ways of evaluating presidential smarts. And some presidents are smart in some departments, not in others. It varies. Sometimes presidents are matched well. Their smarts and the situation they face dovetail. Others not so. Lincoln had his blind spots. One blind spot in particular concerned military strategy. He had never known very much about military life. He used to joke about the fact that his only experience in the military was a few months in the Illinois militia chasing the Sauk and Fox Indians around the forests. And he almost deliberately made fun of that because, as in those days a Whig, the Whigs prided themselves on being the not military party, while they condemned their opposite numbers, the Jacksonian Democrats, as being the party of Andrew Jackson, the military chieftain. This meant that when Lincoln became president and also commander-in-chief, he really did not know very much about the way armies operated. He thought he could teach himself that the same way he'd taught himself law, by borrowing books on the subject and reading them. Unfortunately, mastering the art of war is a very different proposition, a much more experiential proposition than mastering the technicalities of statutes from a book. And for 3 years in the war, Lincoln kept insisting that there was a particular strategic solution to things, and that was the slog, the heavy slog overland, invading Virginia and aiming at the destruction of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But it turned out that by the middle of the 19th century, armies had grown too large to be easily destroyed, at least in one battle. What was more, because armies had grown so large, they had become extremely dependent, tethered to important cities and railheads. In Lee's case, the city of Richmond and its accompanying rail junction, Petersburg. Over and over again, for the first 3 years of the war, Lincoln kept insisting that they should try to nail down Lee's army and defeat it in one climactic battle. And the result was one frustration after another. Ulysses Grant was given the same message when he took control of the Union armies in 1864. And he too launched an overland campaign that, like the other campaigns, ended up in much the same position, ground to a halt by Robert E. Lee. At which point Grant switched gears completely. He crossed the James River and the Appomattox River and locked Richmond and Petersburg in a siege. That siege, by the spring of 1865, had so worn out Lee's army that they had to abandon Richmond and Petersburg and bolt westward to escape. But they were so enfeebled that they could not. Grant caught up with them and effected the surrender of Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Now, the long and the short of this is that Grant had the right idea. It was not the pursuit of Lee's army that was going to win the war. It was the destruction of Richmond and Petersburg as the supply for Lee's army. Capture Richmond and Petersburg, and Lee's army would fall like an overripe piece of fruit from the tree, which, in fact, is exactly what it did. Grant understood that. It took him a while to persuade Lincoln, but Lincoln had trust and faith in Grant that he did not have in some of those earlier generals. And so Lincoln was willing to admit the possibility that he had been wrong. He stepped back, he let Grant have control, and Grant won the war. And Lincoln said, once Grant was in command of the armies, for the first time during the war, he was able to sleep at night. Now, what that illustrates is that Lincoln was an excellent president in many respects, but not in all respects. Nor has there ever been a president who was excellent or perfect in every respect. What I think we have to be grateful for is that the strengths Lincoln did bring to the presidency, persistence, eloquence, knowledge, his mastery of the organization, those turned out to be exactly the qualities needed in the time of the Civil War. The remarkable thing is that almost no one in 1860 could have predicted that this raw-boned lawyer from Illinois would be the one man in the country who had those qualities. How grateful we must be that in that time of the nation's greatest crisis, somehow the pointer, the dial, pointed to Abraham Lincoln. He became the president, and he guided us to victory and to success, even at the cost of his own life.
I'm Tom Rosenkrantz from Northumberland, just down the road. Do you have recommendations for a favorite Lincoln biography or most accurate?
A favorite biography of Lincoln? Well, I think the biography, which certainly is the go-to biography for anyone who wants to understand Abraham Lincoln, is Michael Burlingame's 2 volumes, Abraham Lincoln, A Life. It's almost more than a biography, it's almost an encyclopedia of Lincolniana. And it's a big book, big 2 volumes in a green binding that Michael refers to as the Big Green Monster. Well, it is a comprehensive biography, and in terms of being able to become acquainted with every nook and cranny of Lincoln's life and the sources on Lincoln's life, that simply is not to be beaten. In terms of a shorter 1-volume, straight-from-the-shoulder biography, I always recommend to people a biography written in 1953 by Benjamin P. Thomas, simply Abraham Lincoln, a biography. And despite the fact that it's 66 years old, it's never been out of print, and it is still, for a 1-volume biography of Lincoln, probably the very best thing that's available out there on the market. There is I should add, there is a biography of Lincoln called Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, but it's written by someone I really don't like to talk about in public. I think you know what I mean. Those 2, Benjamin Thomas's single-volume Life of Lincoln and Michael Burlingame's 2 volumes, that will take you down either of 2 paths. One, the swift, direct, and eloquent words of Benjamin Thomas, or the comprehensive encyclopedic coverage of Lincoln's life in the hands of the great Michael Burlingame.
What about Sandburg?
Sandburg takes us to 4 volumes, and it's great poetry. Whether it's particularly accurate biography is another story entirely. It's wonderful writing, it's a great piece of American literature, but I have significant reservations about recommending it as a piece of reliable biography, because Sandburg was, after all, he was a poet. He was a literary person. There was no good story about Lincoln that he could resist, whether it was true or not. He didn't ask enough questions about the sources. Wonderful reading, but if we want to go straight for the historical record, I think Burlingame and Thomas are the paths to it. Well, if there are no further questions, then I believe, Professor Sievers, I will turn the podium back over to you, and you can bring things to a conclusion this evening. Thank you all very much for coming out.
Thanks so much to Professor Guelzo for a really wonderful talk and a great kickoff to our series. The Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship also has another series which has some events coming up still this semester. This particular series will pick up again in the spring, so look for notices on more events there. Maybe ask my colleague, Professor Riley, to talk a little bit about the events coming up in the other series. Is that okay?
Well, I could just maybe remind folks that the next event in that series is happening on November 14th. Where is that happening? Over in Bucknell Hall, I believe. We'll be welcoming Heather McDonald, who is an author of a number of books that I think at least some folks in the room, I know a few folks in the room have read, and she's going to talk a little bit about her most recent book, The Diversity Delusion, which is a criticism of a fair amount of stuff that's been going on in the last couple of decades in universities just like this one. So we're hopeful that folks might make it out for that one, again, November 14th, 7 p.m. over in Bucknell Hall. And we'll hopefully we'll have a little bit of a discussion after she gives her talk, Q&A, more or less along the lines of what we just saw tonight with Professor Guelzo. And might I say too, just in thanks to Professor Guelzo, what a wonderful opportunity it was you've given us to learn a little bit more about Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, and to motivate us to go out and think a little bit more about the meaning of this piece of history, not just as an historical artifact, but also in terms of how it resonates in contemporary American culture and political life. Thank you so much for coming out and talking with us tonight.
And the series that my colleague just mentioned is a series on, what's the title?
It's Campus Politics and Civil Liberties is the name of the series. We've already had a couple of speakers in September and earlier this month, and so in addition to Heather McDonald in November, we have another speaker in December. I'm going to get the dates wrong. You sprung this on me without my being able to consult the web page, but I believe it's December 5th. Jason Manning, who is a sociologist who's studied a lot of the same phenomena that Heather McDonald's going to talk about, but Manning is a sociologist who's looking at this as a matter of broad cultural changes in American society. And then we have a final talk in that series that's happening at some point in March. Chris Ellis is somewhere here in the crowd, and so he can give me, what's the date in March? I'm putting you on the spot now. You can look at the website. We've got it's bplc.bucknell.blogs.edu, I believe. And to get the specific date for that final talk, which is Laura Kipnis, who has done some writing recently most specifically about Title IX on college campuses. And so she'll be here in March to wrap up that series. We had a little bit of overlap between the two series, but for the most part, the Campus Politics series is concentrated in this semester, and the American Identities series is concentrated in the spring semester.
So in the American, that's right, yeah, in the American Identity series, we'll have talks kicking off in the spring semester related to socioeconomic identity, related to citizenship, related to sexual identities, and wrapping up with a final talk by the historian Victor Davis Hanson on the 70th anniversary of the Korean War and what that says about America's identity in the world. So be on the lookout for announcements for all these talks. And as Professor Riley mentioned, the talk tonight really was a wonderful kickoff to the series. It reminds us of the need to reflect on what it means to be American, and certainly what Professor Guelzo said tonight is a great reminder of what it really means to be an American, despite all of our differences. So let's give him one more round of applause, and thank you.